Hello everyone, today we're looking at Learning Aim D and we're looking at the final elements of Learning Aim D, mainly focusing on guidance. When selecting the style of guidance that you will use in your lessons, you need to consider the following: the personality, the learning style of the learners, the type of skill being taught, environmental factors, and then the stage of learning, whether that be the cognitive, associative, or the autonomous. You may notice that there's a theme. So these quite often pop up when selecting various elements of our lesson. And when you reflect back on that now, you'll be able to understand as to why. So with regards to D5, on the specification, you need to add in these elements. So can you try to work out what the 4 different types of guidance are from the pictures that I've shared below? And just to be clear, guidance is a method of conveying information to a performer. Pause the slide now and give yourself a chance to have a think. So we've got 4 different types. We have visual, manual, verbal, and mechanical. And in each image, you'll have a clue as to why. So for us, visual, a form of information that can be seen. Verbal, a form of information that can be heard. Manual, physically assisting a movement. Mechanical, using an aid or an object to assist movement. And what we need to think about at BTEC level, for those students that are pushing for distinction, is what are the pros and cons of each? Who is the best to use these types of guidance with? Do we use it with individuals or teams or beginners or elite? And in your D5 element, you will need to evaluate using those pointers. So I'm going to run through each of them in a little bit more detail, following on from the definitions that we've already shared. So visual guidance is the seeing element. In PE lessons, we can do that quite easily with demonstrations. As we get to more of an elite level, we can use things like video or performance analysis. And in an amateur level, for instance, in gymnastics, we can use pictures of gymnastics movements or balances and then share them with the class. Ideally, visual guidance should also be supported with the verbal clues. So there we've got 2 different styles of guidance issued at the same time. So with visual guidance, we use that quite often with beginners. And I'll allow you some time just to read through the others. So verbal guidance. Verbal guidance is the hearing element, as we have discussed earlier. And quite often in PE lessons, we use those by identifying teaching points and using those teaching points as cues or trigger words for instructions. So if we're looking at, let's say, netball and we're focusing on footwork, we can identify footwork as a teaching point and hopefully develop some pointers around that so that when we say footwork in the lesson, it encourages people to think about the footwork that's taking place. So again, we can use this at all levels, but especially elite levels. With elite performers, we can start to use more detailed instructions, maybe making them a little bit more complex and therefore allowing them to be able to break that information down. If we were to do that with beginners, it would be a lot harder for beginners to process the information. So it's really important that we keep verbal guidance for beginners quite simple. Again, there are more pointers in the blue boxes. I would suggest pausing the slides to read through to add. Manual guidance, and manual guidance refers to assisting, and usually assisting individuals. So it means that we can look at guiding the performer through a movement. In our image, you can see we've got a performer practicing on the beam, and the coach is just supporting them as they rotate through that forward or backward cartwheel, depending on which way they're moving. You also see things like manual guidance in lessons like tennis, where you can manipulate the person's position, or in a badminton lesson where you're manipulating shoulders in order to ensure that the correct connection with the shuttlecock. Again, pause the slide now to read the blue box. And then finally, we have mechanical guidance. Mechanical guidance uses an object or an aid, quite often used in gymnastics or in swimming, or particularly in the beginning stage of riding a bike when we use stabilizers. In our image here, you can see that the young people swimming are using the float so that they're ensuring that their body is at the correct positioning in the water. The float is encouraging them to do that. In gymnastics, if you go back to the slide where we was attempting to guess the different types, the final slide that represented mechanical guidance had a harness for trampolining or for gymnastics, and the harness actually helps the person to get used to the feeling of rotation. So if they're learning to do a somersault, they go through the rotation process in a safe manner before they attempt it without the harness. So it's really good for beginners. It's also really good for elite performers when trying to potentially learn a difficult skill. However, quite often it's used in the very, very early stages so that we can ensure that the foundations are correct. So this is the elements that I wanted to focus on a little bit more. So in order to achieve distinction standard, we know that we usually have to provide some kind of evaluation. So in this case, we can look at identifying who the beginners are and who the elite are in terms of our lesson. What is our lesson going to look like? And then identifying how we can use those methods of guidance within our lessons. So evaluate beginners versus elite. To give an example of that, with beginners, we can often use manual mechanical guidance as well as visual. However, as we get to an elite level, we might use manual and mechanical guidance slightly less, unless we're coming back after injury or potentially learning a difficult skill. With regards to verbal, we can talk about verbal being short and sharp with basic information, as we said. However, with elite, it can be a lot more complex and fine-tuned. In your D5 element, you need to ensure that you are evaluating both sides. So this one looks at the different styles of guidance in comparison to beginners or elite. I would take the content on this slide with a pinch of salt and be able to go into a little bit more of evaluative detail here. And to give you an example of that, a beginner, yes, they use visual guidance. They do use visual guidance, and we use visual guidance a lot in terms of demonstrations. However, when we look at the elite box, it says it's unlikely to need much visual guidance. That's not always the case. If, for example, you've got a football manager, let's use Zidane at Real Madrid. Zidane, obviously one of the most highly regarded football players of his generation. If he's your manager and he's introducing how to take free kicks, he might be able to provide a visual demonstration to a performer that is currently highly regarded in their current generation now. So it's important that there is an element of visual guidance. However, it might be less likely than the beginner. So with D5, you need to go away. You need to evaluate beginners versus an elite, who use it, when they use it, and identify opportunities to use all of the different types of guidance in your lesson. It might be that you choose not to. So, for example, if you're doing a lesson on dribbling, you may not use mechanical guidance because we do not really use mechanical guidance when teaching football in the early stages at our level. Best of luck.